Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. It's always exciting when I get the chance to interview a debut author, especially when that person is as fabulous, talented and supportive as my next guest. Many of you will know or have heard of Dani Vee through her prolific and energetic podcast, Words and Nerds. Through this podcast, Dani has championed hundreds of authors and their work, interviewed other podcasters like me, supported festivals and garnered much respect and admiration from all who have had the very great fortune to find themselves in her orbit. Earlier this month, Dani's debut fiction title made its way into the world. Published by Larrikin House, My Extraordinary Mum is a gorgeous children's picture book illustrated by the talented Alexandra Colombo that celebrates mothers in all their different and unique forms. The perfect book to share with kids and to remind everyone that mums are indeed extraordinary. And here to talk about her beautiful book and first foray into the publishing world is the extraordinary Dani Vee herself. Welcome to the podcast, Dani.
Wow, that's such an amazing intro. I feel a little bit embarrassed.
It's all true.
Well, thank you. I was like, oh, wow, she's talking about me. That's weird.
I am talking about you, Dani. Now, I wanted to say, for the record, congratulations on the publication of My Extraordinary Mum. How are you
Thank
feeling?
you. Oh, it's a weird feeling. Like I don't know that I've taken much time to stop and celebrate because it's just a lot to do. And I didn't actually expect how stressful book launches are, but they're really stressful, particularly in the age of COVID when you're like, oh, probably no one's going to show up. And there's just a lot to think about. And so I had one in Sydney, one in Melbourne. They were both as stressful as each other, but amazing. I just created the stress myself. There was no reason for me to be stressed. And then there's always the next thing, like how do you get people to care about your book? Like lots of people do care, but then outside of our beautiful writing community sphere, how do I get people to care about the book? So you're always thinking, what can I do next? Should I go to bookshops? Should I do school visits? Should I do this interview? All this stuff. So it's kind of like this never ending, but my brain is like that. Yeah. Just this never ending thought process. So it's been amazing, but I don't think I expected how overwhelming it would be as well.
Yeah, look, I can only imagine. So I wondered if you were still at that pinch me stage or are you kind of sick of talking about it?
No, it's definitely that pinch me stage. So especially when, you asked me to come on the podcast, I'm like, oh, really? Oh, I can talk about a book, And then even when you've got your book behind me, I'm like, oh, wow. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I'm still like wowing a lot.
It's no mean feat to get a book out into the world these days. It's a highly competitive industry and it's a small industry here in Australia. So look, honestly, I take my hat off to you. Not only are you an incredibly busy person in general, but you've managed this incredible achievement and yeah.
No, I appreciate that, but I think it was always the next hurdle, and I don't know if that ever ends, and it's certainly not a complaint. I'm just not sure that I expected it. You go to uni, you get your degree, yay, I've got my degree, I get a job. Well, hopefully, but with this, it's like, oh, I write something, someone maybe will like it, then I've got to get it signed, and then maybe it will get published and printed, and maybe we'll find an illustrator, and maybe I'll be able to edit it well, and maybe it will be in bookshops, and it's always the next thing.
Yeah.
And you always, I don't know if it's just me, but always sort of waiting for something to go wrong, what's going to happen at this next stage. And then obviously the next stage is I think the hardest is the publicity stage, because how do you publicity? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why you and I exist in the world.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't actually appreciate what we did until I wrote a book. I'm like, oh, that's why people want to speak to us, because people care that you've written a book. I get it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I guess that leads on really quite nicely to my next question, which was, well, whilst you're not new to book publicity, I wondered if it felt different to you to be out there talking about your own book and being on the other side of the microphone.
Yeah, it does feel weird because I've always, like the last 5 years, I've spent talking about other people's books, and although I've been the host, I've tried my best to make it about the books and about the people I'm interviewing. I always say to people, this is your interview, you talk about whatever you want, etc. And I try and do a lot of listening where I can, not butt in and tell a joke, but or my attempt at a joke. But yeah, it's kind of weird because you have to publicize your book, and I'm a big believer in that you should just be celebrating what's important to you and your achievements. And I know we don't really have a culture of that in Australia, but I think it's okay to do that. If you've got something cool to celebrate, let's all celebrate it. But yeah, there's that voice in the back of your head going, oh, like, are people a bit over me crapping on about my book? So there's that little voice in your head going, I'm really excited about it, but I don't know, how long's a piece of string, and they say you have to sort of show people something like 9 times before they even take notice of it. So you've got that in your head, and then the conflicting argument about, well, I guess, is there such a thing as oversaturation? So I'm doing a lot of overthinking, Claudine, which is not unlike me, but it is different. And I could celebrate authors all day without thinking about it and put them on Insta. But I guess with yourself, you're always going, oh, I really want to share this review because someone took time out to actually write that review. And I know how, long that takes, and you really appreciate that. But, you don't want to sort of have a whole Facebook thread that's a tribute to yourself either.
Yeah, I do understand where you're coming from in that regard. But you know what? I think it's important to celebrate our achievements just like
So do
you
I.
do. Don't hide your light. Why should we? I'm the first one to advocate for people who take the time to review books, and people like us who take the time to talk about other people's books. That's something to share.
Yeah,
it's only
absolutely.
right and fair that you share that.
And I'm a person that if I had a choice, you'd celebrate everything. You don't choose to just celebrate one thing, just celebrate everything. Life is mainly mundane and working and paying bills and doing dishes. So when you've got the chance to celebrate something, whether it's for yourself or someone else, like, go and do it. I don't think there can be enough cheerleaders or celebrations of people, particularly in this industry, because it's a difficult industry. You never know when your next book deal's coming. You never know if it's going to sell, how well it's going to be received. It's tricky. It's a really tricky industry.
It is indeed. Now, Dani, I know that you've been writing for a while and you work as a teacher, but I wondered if it was always your intention to write a picture book, and did you imagine that this was what you would publish first?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I kind of was going down the crime fiction path for a long time because I've loved reading it. Crime fiction turns out is really hard to write. Not saying that picture books aren't, but crime writing, 90,000 words, and you've got different layers, and our readers are much more intelligent now, and they expect lots of character development, lots of twists. And so I'm still dabbling in that path, but it doesn't surprise me that I wrote a picture book first, or got a picture book published first, because I've always thought they were magical. As a kid, I was an avid reader, thanks to my mum, who used to buy me, golden books every time we went grocery shopping. So I loved that. Even though it wasn't a picture book, it's got illustrations and words, and I used to just read them over and over. I've still got them from the 80s. They've got the date in them. So I've still got like 1983.
Oh, so sweet.
So they're really cute. And then, I think picture books, when I had my own kids, I always think they're time capsules. They're not just books, they're moments in time where you sat in bed with your kids and you were tired, or you're new to parenting, or it was the end of the day and it was that time to relax and unwind and just spend that quality time with your child and be present. And I don't know about you, but even when I see picture books that I used to read my kids, it just brings back this flood of memories. I can remember where I was, how many pages, the favorite pages we used to talk about. So I do think picture books are timeless. I think they're time capsules, and I think they're kind of magical because they bring you back to that time. When you smell a perfume and you go, oh my God, that was my mum's perfume when I was growing up, and it just brings back this flood of memories. I feel like picture books are like that too. So it's not a surprise that I got that published first, because they've always been really, well, it is a surprise to get published at all, full stop. But in terms of the medium, I think it was always something that I wanted to do, and I love poetry. So I've always, I've been a teacher. I was a teacher for 17 years, English teacher. And, I loved teaching poetry and loved analysing poetry. And I think picture books in some ways are little poems, because the meter and the rhythm are really important, whether they rhyme or whether they're in prose. It's got that, beautiful rhythm and meter to it. And I think that's sort of maybe all the poetry I've read and taught since, school and uni and teaching sort of stuck in my brain somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. So what was the inspiration for this particular story?
Yeah, it was twofold. And it's interesting because, James, the publisher, was always going, what's the buy-in for the kid? What's the buy-in for the kid? Because that's his sort of big motivation. And the first one was that I would talk to my kids about, when I went to Europe on my own and when I bungee jumped, and I'd take them rock climbing, and they kind of couldn't believe that I'd done all this stuff, and they kind of didn't believe it. And then I saw a mosh pit on TV once and said, oh, I did that once, and I went crowd surfing, and they were like, what? Who are you? And then I thought, wow, it's really bizarre that you can live in the same household, sleep in the same bed most nights when they crawl in, and they can still not know who you are. And then I thought, hang on, that's the same as, when I met my grandparents. They were of a particular age and I never knew them when they were young. So I feel like there's these missing pieces of people's lives that you don't know, even though you are the closest people to them and you live with them. And so I thought this book could really open up conversations about, who you were before you had them, what you've taken of that piece of you into, your life when you've had children, and just have these really fun conversations, because they were really fun. And then I showed the kids a video of me bungee jumping. They're like, we don't even know who you are. And so I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
The second thing that was really important to me is that when I'd watch mainstream media, I'd see a lot of mums who were the bringers of band-aids or the nurturers, and that's fine, but they were nothing else. Or I'd see them reining in the fun that dad was having with the kids. They'd be wrestling and mum saying, don't break the vase. And I just thought, how did we become so small? How did women get pushed into these little boxes of nurturers and fun killers, when I know so many women, including yourself, who are smart and talented and educated and creative and amazing and adventurous, and who have a million experiences behind them and ahead of them? How did we get pushed into such small boxes as soon as we become mothers? And so I really wanted to explore the idea of, well, what if a mother was nurturing and loved her child and was present, but what if she was also really cool and adventurous and seized the day and went on road trips and went skinny dipping and created families within her community? Like, would that make her less of a mother?
Yeah.
Of course it doesn't, but it always makes me question why mothers particularly are sort of shrunk down into these little boxes where our identity is kind of lost once we become parents.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. It's just so well said. So, Dani, for those who haven't read your book yet, as I have, I wondered if you could tell listeners a little bit more about it.
Oh, a little elevator pitch. People always hate me for making them do that. So now revenge time for Dani. Yeah, it starts off, it's in the narrative voice of a child. In this case, it's a little girl, but I don't actually think that matters. It's just a child and parent relationship. And, she's describing her mum and says, she's kind of quirky and she's bold, but I like it. And you see the daughter having her own identity, but also kind of emulating her mum and sort of finding out who she is. And I guess the whole crux of the story, besides the two things that I just told you before, were that it's okay to be yourself, whoever that is, and so we have a whole sort of story of them having, drum circles in the middle of the night, and her mum collecting stray animals, and the kitchen's full of these weird animals, bats hanging from the fridge, and a little guinea pig and a turtle that's actually on every page throughout the book. And she's skinny dipping, and they're going on road trips without a map, and they're doing yoga and twisting themselves into pretzels on mountains. But then what was really important to me was to have those quiet pages at the end that says, being extraordinary isn't just about bungee jumping and rollerblading and breakdancing in the grocery store. Being extraordinary is having emotional intelligence and knowing when that day is that everyone just needs to stay at home in their pajamas, eat chocolate cake and take care of each other, and I thought that was really important as well. And then towards the end of the book, not assuming that other people's positions. And so just being kind and just smiling at people can just make this massive difference. And it sounds a bit cheesy, right? But I feel like we don't give enough compliments. Maybe they stay in our head. And so I really tried to make an effort over the last couple of years that if I think something nice about someone, I just say it. So I don't do it disingenuinely. But if I think, you've done a great job, or I love your book, or you're amazing, it's in your head. You're the most critical of yourself than anyone else is. So sometimes you might be having, I know I've been having sometimes, you have this awful or anxious day. And then someone says, hey, you did a really good job, or wow, that dress looks really cool. And you just turns your whole day around.
Yeah. Dani, as mentioned earlier, the book is superbly illustrated by Alexandra Colombo. So I wanted to ask you, did you have any input into into who would do the illustrations, or was that entirely the publisher's decision?
Yeah, in terms of finding an illustrator, Larrikin House are really open to anyone suggesting someone, so you
Hmm.
could go, oh, I like this person. They'd have a look, we'd have a chat about it,
Yeah.
have a little bit of a yes, no kind of decision. But it was actually really difficult to find the mum that was all in our heads. I was really lucky that, James, the publisher, Mary, the creative director, and Crystal, the editor, and myself, we all shared the same vision for this book, which I don't know if that's unusual, but we really had a clear vision of what this should look like. And so we all sort of agreed when something wasn't right, but it was actually quite difficult to find a mum like this, because in a lot of books, mums were quite, traditional, and, they weren't wild, red-haired, skinny-dipping mothers in a, cool yellow van. And so it was actually quite tricky to find. And so I gave up because I was looking and looking and looking, like, I don't know what I'm doing. This is not my space. And so we left it to Mary, who sent me the first preliminary pictures of this mum. And she was wearing this boheme dress. She was holding a drum. She had this wild red hair. And even though initially I kind of had a Lisa Bonet kind of vibe in my head of who the mum should be, as soon as I saw this mum, I think I emailed back in 5 seconds going, that's her. And we all just went, that's her. Like, no one doubted it for a second.
Yeah.
So I didn't have anything to do with the finding of Alexandra, but she was the perfect person to illustrate the book. She just really got it. Like, she just really got the book and the vibe and the movement and the color and the joy and everything I was trying to achieve. It's like she wrote it herself. and then, I had a couple of basic illo notes, but I deliberately didn't have too many because I just wanted her to put her layer on top of it, because I think that adds so much more. And so when I read through the book and noticed the animals who have such personality, they're doing yoga on the mats, which is really cool, and the turtle on every page, and the just, I don't know, I can see the bond between the mother and child in the images. And so she just really added this really special layer and element to it. It's funny, I only spoke to Alexandra via Instagram chat about 2 days ago. I hadn't spoken to her before because the publisher was the conduit before it, and it just came up that we just started speaking to each other, and I just went, I can't believe I haven't told you that you've just done an incredible job on this. Like, I love this so much. So, but I kind of liked not being involved in it because I don't know what I'm doing in terms of design and illustration, so I feel like I shouldn't be involved in that process and trust the experts, which I'm glad that I did.
In that process, did you get to see various pages in various stages of development, or did they want you to see it all when it was all done?
Yeah, so Larrikin House are pretty good at including, their authors and illustrators in the entire process. And so they'll kind of send you a whole spread of preliminary drawings. In this case, it was odd in some ways because normally you get like a pencil sketch sort of drawing of a grid of all the pages. But Alexandra's process is, literally these wild scribbles that you really can't tell what they are. And then they go from these amazing, beautiful, perfect illustrations. So we just kind of had to trust that it was going to work because she managed to turn these wild scribbles into what you see in the picture book. But, before it goes to print and gets approved, we got the sheet of all the images, and you got to make little notes about certain things, but I can't remember changing a thing, to be honest. Like, there might have been something minor, but nothing sticks in my head because every page I was just like, wow, wow. There's only one page which is my favorite page, is when they're in the community having a barbecue, and I didn't want to comment on it, but my illo notes where I really wanted a lot of diversity in the 2 pages, and I just wanted lots of age groups, different cultures, people from different backgrounds, people with differing abilities, but I didn't want to comment on it because I just wanted it to represent, the communities we live in, and I think that's important for kids to see themselves.
Can you take us through your journey to publication? I wanted to know specifically, how did you go from that initial concept to holding the book in your hands?
It's pretty wild. You think about how did that idea in my head? Like, I remember I had this idea in my head in the car. And then I pressed record on my phone. I started recording myself as I was driving, and I was stuck in traffic. And it's weird that turns into a book, know. So I always, even though I was writing crime, still writing crime here, I always was dabbling with little picture books and kids' books, particularly, having kids of my own and sort of figuring out what they thought was funny, and doing that. And then Adrian and I, we did the Publishing Insider Words and Nerds spin-off. And a lot of people you just want to know more about the publishing industry, because it does feel like it's a bit secretive, and I don't think it means to be. I just think there's a lot that goes on that we don't know. And so we thought, well, let's do a 10 episode spin-off where we talk to publishers and agents and booksellers and lots of cool people in the industry that will give us an insight into the industry. And one of those people was James Layton from Larrikin House. And, you know, from the minute he got onto the podcast, the three of us, we just had a ball. You know, we just had the greatest time. We really vibed. We really got each other. We had these great laughs. And I'd loved Larrikin House for a long time, because we interviewed Jacinta Demaze, we interviewed HarperCollins. And so we went through the people that we really wanted to interview. Yeah. And one of them that we both agreed on was Larrikin House. And even though they're a small publisher in comparison to HarperCollins, we just loved their books. You know, they were beautiful quality. They were quirky and weird. And we just thought they're trying to do something a little bit different. Yeah. And so when we got off that podcast episode, I just said to Adrian, I think I'm going to pitch my idea. I think I get the brand, and I think the three of us just had a really, you know, good chat, and I have this understanding. And so it was a couple of days later where I just emailed back and said, hey, can I pitch something? And so I pitched two books. One is Forever Parked, which I'm sort of glad. I don't know how I even thought that was a good idea, but I don't know. So I'm glad that sort of is in Parked land.
Yeah.
And then I just had this idea, and I just sort of pitched the mum, and he's like, yeah, go write it. Come back to me and write it. And so it took me about 2 weeks to sort of get out of my head what I wanted. And then I, because, you know, we're podcasters, I recorded my manuscript, because I thought, being in prose, I thought the rhythm was really important, and I wanted to, you know, for him to hear it. So I also sent a Word document, but it was actually the podcast reading of it that actually got his attention. And so then I had a meeting with him and Crystal, and you know, one of his first words was, I hate the ending, change it. And so I just deleted it on the spot, because I just thought, he's the publisher, I'll just, you know, if he doesn't like the ending, I'll change it. Like, I always feel like I'm not going to run out of words, you know, there's plenty of words to be written. And so I think, you know, that was also one of the reasons why I got signed, because he just goes, you're really easy to work with, you know. And so I worked with Crystal quite intensely to squeeze the book out that we knew existed that wasn't there yet. Yeah. So there were a few different versions of it, and we sort of tried all different things until, you know, the one that you see came into itself. But it's sort of, it changed from being, you know, the mother's voice, the child's voice, and the child, you know, doing more narrative of what she wants, and then brought it back again to actually what it is. So it's interesting. I've got all the different versions on my computer, and it's different. It's really cool how different they read and how, but I think you almost have to do that different weird version to get to the one you've got. So it was a really interesting process, to do that. And then, of course, because I can't keep quiet, I'm like, you know, I think Larrikin House need to do festivals. And I think Larrikin House needs to start talking to really established authors and sign them. And I think we need to do this. And so they were just like, sure, go do that. And so then I just started doing publicity, and, you know, Larrikin did their first Somerset this year, and we're doing all sorts of different, you know, festivals this year, just to, I guess, raise the profile of the brand, which was already a really great brand, doing great things with, you know, Scott Stewart's My Shadow is Pink, which has sold phenomenally well internationally. And I just thought, you know, this little brand needs to be everywhere. So I hope I've helped to do that a little bit too.
Well, I love that story. That was just fantastic. And I love how proactive you were. You saw an opportunity and you went for it, and it really paid off for you. And I'm so delighted. It's just incredible. So you and I talk to authors, particularly debut authors, all the time. And I think that we have a fair sense of how hard it can be to get out there and talk about your work for the first time, to accept that putting your work out there for public consumption can be scary and can make you feel vulnerable. But I guess I wondered if being a podcaster and understanding that premise made it any easier for you to cope with the reality of your book being released into the world.
It's a really good question. And I guess I didn't understand what it's like to be on the other side of the podcast. You know, being the podcaster, the host, you lead the questions, you hope you make your guests feel at ease, you know, you tell them how much you love their book, otherwise you wouldn't be interviewing them. And so I guess, you know, like I said to you, I think off air before we started, being on this side of the podcast is equally as terrifying as cool. Terrifying because you have no control, because you're in control, and, you know, it's hard for someone like me who likes to control everything. So hot secret from my personality. control freak. But it's also kind of cool because I'm like, oh, what should I prepare? I don't need to prepare anything because I'm just going to talk about my book, and I've lived with my book for a year and I know I can talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting beast, but I think what's been really valuable is seeing how tricky the industry is, how even really established successful authors like Jack Heath doubt themselves. You know, he said he doubts himself every time he's 75% into his book. He questions whether he can write. And if Jack Heath is feeling that way, then it's okay for Dani to feel like that way all through her writing process. So I think I knew the realities of it. And I know, you know, my dad's a creative. He's been a musician, and even though, you know, my mum doesn't play an instrument, she's always also a very creative person in terms of, you know, things that she creates around the house. So I think I've always been around creative people. So I know that with that kind of drive and talent and that magic that those kind of people have, there's also this real vulnerability. And it's interesting because I was speaking to someone about my anxiety, and I said, which, you know, it does at times take over my you know, brain, where I can't, you know, sort of function fully. But I think on the flip side of that, and I don't want to stereotype, but I often think people with creative brains, they often come with that sort of anxiety or other things that they have to manage with their mental health. And I'm not saying that with everyone, but I feel like it's common just anecdotally. I've done no research on this, just anecdotally. And then someone said to me, would you take away, you know, the energy you have and the creativity you have if you could, you know, if you got rid of your anxiety, but it meant you had to lose those things as well, would you do that? And even though my anxiety is at times terrifying and debilitating, I feel like I wouldn't, because that's just part of who you are. And if that, you know, incredible energy that we have and the creativity that I hope I have, if that just has to come hand in hand with anxiety, well, that's what it is, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting concept to have that kind of acceptance of yourself and who you are and all those things that come with creativity. So
I think you make a very excellent point that so many creatives have a lot of self-doubt. I think it kind of comes with the territory, you know. You don't necessarily, you know, I think you second guess yourself a lot, and you wonder if people are going to, you know, enjoy your work. Like you said to me before, you know, you can't believe that people, you know, I've got it sitting on the shelf behind me, and then I'm, you know, celebrating your work. But why?
People say, they like it. I'm like, really? Did you really like it? Are you just saying that?
Yeah. But I kind of feel like that comes with the territory.
Yeah, I do too. And I think self-doubt is actually a really good thing if you can manage it properly. I think self-doubt makes you make the work better, because you think, oh, that's not good enough, I can do better than that, that's not good enough. But as long as you don't fall over to the knife's edge, which I have occasionally, where you're paralyzed by it, you know, because that's not going to help you create anything. So I think self-doubt is okay for checking yourself and for trying to squeeze the best work out of your brain. But I think if it's going to paralyze you, then you have to find a new way to manage that self-doubt. So it's like anxiety, you know, it sits next to you constantly. Sometimes it's tiny, sometimes it fills the whole room. And you've just got to know how to manage it at each stage.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there was one thing that you'd like readers to take away from your book, Dani, what would it be?
I'd really love people to have the conversation about how mothers and why their identities are so hard to reclaim. And I was talking to someone before, and I felt that when you have children, this is my experience anyway, I felt like that I was completely dismantled, because you didn't really expect everything, you know, from childbirth onwards. You didn't expect to feel all these things that you feel, you know, not only the unconditional love, but the unconditional worry, the continued mother guilt, which I'm trying to shed. All of those things, you know, I grew up in my 20s and 30s being, you know, incredibly selfish and traveling and doing whatever I wanted for myself. And then you have children, you go, oh, you know, it's not about me anymore. And I don't even want it to be about me anymore, because it's about these little people. But I find it an opportunity, right? So once you become dismantled, and when I felt my kids started to grow up a little bit, I thought, okay, well, this is my chance to reclaim my identity. And, you know, what do I want to take with me? And then who do I want to be after this experience? It's almost like a rebirth yourself, if you know what I mean. And so I guess I want people to have the conversation about, women's identity after motherhood, because even in newspaper articles, you see mother of two, mother of three, and that's kind of all we are once we have children. And having children is one of the most important things you'll ever do. And I actually love being a mum, and I love hanging out with my kids, but it's not all that we are. So I'd love to start the conversation about reclaiming your identity, not feeling guilty for reclaiming your identity, and seeing women for their whole selves and not just for one component of who they are. I recently asked someone, like a group of people, I said, tell me all the words that you can think of without thinking of how you describe a single mother. And I'm not going to repeat the words because I don't want to feed into that stereotype, but none of them were complimentary. And these people, they weren't being horrible. They were just, saying, words like, oh, struggling, and so I sort of flipped that on its head. And I said, well, what if we started talking about resourceful and independent and organized and, kind of kick-ass and multitasking and learning how to drill holes in the wall, and everyone kind of went, oh, you're right. Like, that's a terrible thing. And it's not that they thought these things. It was because this stereotype somehow has seeped into our brain since birth, that being a particular mother, makes you this. And I guess I just want women and everyone to start the conversations. If you choose to stay at home with your children, amazing. If you choose to work part-time when you have children, amazing. If you choose to go back full-time into the workforce and be a president, amazing. The amount of times that women get asked, oh, are you going back to work? They're questions that men don't get asked. Where are the kids today? Are you really going to go away for a week? Questions that we get asked that fathers often don't get asked, I think is really important for us to acknowledge. I mean, fathers are really bringing it to the table. You see dads doing great things all the time and really being present with their kids, which it wasn't always the case, where dad was the, breadwinner. But yeah, so just those conversations and people to kind of check themselves, to not assume like, oh, where are your children? I don't think fathers really get asked where their children are if they're out on their own. So just these assumptions that we make. And it's frustrating that in 2022, we're still having those conversations. But I got really deep. So besides just having fun and going out and living life and seizing the day and being whoever the hell you want to be, unapologetically, that's a really key part. Also having those really important conversations. But haven't you felt, Claudine, that sometimes in your life you've had to apologize for who you are to people, or you've had to sort of make yourself smaller because people maybe don't accept or like who you are? Like, I'm tired of doing that. I think you get to a particular age where like, if you don't like who I am, that's cool. We don't need to hang out.
That's right.
And you find your tribe, you find the people who like you. And how good do you feel when you're in a room of people who everyone is just being themselves?
Yeah.
I went to a dinner party a couple of weeks ago where everyone was just exactly who they were. And it was a bit wild and it was a bit great. And we all had deep meaningfuls and we'd flip over to laughing hysterically on the lounge. And that was because everyone felt safe to be exactly who they are. And so that's a massive takeaway from this book for kids as well. School's hard. School is so hard. You've got to be this and you've got to act like this and you've got to like this and you've got to be good at this. And wouldn't it be cool if from school age we could just be whoever we wanted, as long as you're a nice,
as long as you're
are,
nice,
you're not
kind.
You're not stealing people's lunches out of their bag, but, just being whoever that quirky human being is. And, I hope that I've instilled that in my kids. And sometimes I have to check myself and go, oh, is this okay for them to be doing this? Are they going to, their peers not going to understand? And then I just have to go, no, this is my whole philosophy. I tell them to be themselves. I can't then rein them in when they want to be. Because my son, gorgeous child that he is, he wanted to wear his sister's skirt to his disco. And a part of me, it was such a conflict, Claudine. A part of me was like, yeah, dude, go do it. I love that. Then another part of me was the protective mother going, are his friends going to hassle him out? So in the end, and I hated myself for thinking that, because that's not my philosophy. But as a mum, you can't help but want to protect your children, from any kind of horrors that school has in store for them. And so we just had this chat and I was just really honest about it. I said, look, dude, I love it. I think you're amazing. He wears dresses when we go to the shop, no problem. But I said, I just need you to be prepared for people's reactions if they're not ready for that. And so we kind of had this little plan that he was going to do it, but then if he didn't feel comfortable, he'd just take the skirt off and give it to a teacher and they'd mind it. Turns out everyone thought he was amazing. So I was worrying for nothing. But it's that real conflict where you want people to be absolutely themselves, but that mother brain kicks in like, oh, they're going to be okay.
Yeah. Talking about your identity, a huge part of your identity, I feel, talking as somebody from the outside, has been Words and Nerds. So let's talk about it for a moment. An iconic Australian podcast and one that authors near and far clamour to appear on. I think it's been going, I think you said near on 5 years now, an incredible 500 plus episodes published to date. You've interviewed some of the biggest names in the industry, including Trent Dalton, Matthew Riley, Jackie French, Andy Griffiths, and so many more. So I wanted to ask you, Dani, how has being a podcaster and speaking with all of these talented writers influenced you as a writer, do you think, or has it impacted you in other ways?
Yeah, it's funny because that was part of my dismantling rebirthing process where I wasn't at work, I was at home with the children. Even though that was amazing, I was craving those conversations that I'd have as an English teacher with my colleagues and students. And so I started the podcast hoping people would talk to me about their books. Turns out people want to talk about their books. Funnily, if only I'd known this. They sure do. If only I'd known this earlier. But yeah, I think I've learned a lot in terms of, like we said, the vulnerabilities that come with writing. And even if you're a prolific, successful, incredibly talented writer, you still have those self-doubts. So that makes you feel like that's okay. The struggles as well and the reality of writing. When I speak to, who's become one of my best friends, Adrienne Beck, who I met on the podcast quite early on, just the real honesty about the industry, and hearing from people. And even when I was doing, NaNoWriMo, and I was the only unpublished author at that time with Tristan Banks, Julianne Negri, Christy Byrne and Adrienne, they were just so encouraging and supportive. And so I guess I also learned that that's part of the industry. There's a hard and tricky bit, but wow, the people that you get to meet and get to support and encourage you are phenomenally encouraging and supportive and welcoming. And it's just a beautiful community. I think the third sort of most important thing I learned, and this came straight from Trent Dalton, and I say this all the time, but for this book particularly, it was so important. You can know all your technical stuff as you do, you learn, you go to writers' workshops, etc. Yeah, so Trent Dalton said that you've just got to put your heart and soul on the page. And I think I was a little bit obsessed with the technical parts before I really had that conversation with myself. And that has to do with vulnerability, and I always thought being a woman of the world, you had to be stoic and you couldn't let people see you cry and you had to be strong. And, when I was leading an English faculty, when I was teaching, I had to be, the unshakable one. And then as I sort of grew older, I thought there's actually strength in vulnerability. And so I actually think you're a stronger person accepting and admitting that you have vulnerabilities and fears, and sometimes you need to ask for help than pretending to be stoic, because inside you're really just falling apart, you're just not telling anyone. So there's strength in asking for help, and there's also strength in putting your heart and soul on the page and really showing people the vulnerability. And I don't know if it comes out, but I did put my heart and soul and fears into this book, the fears that my children didn't know who I was 100%, because that was quite a surprise to me, even though it's obvious in retrospect. And that kind of anger and frustration of how mothers are too often perceived in 2022. It's like, really? We're in 2022 and this is still conversations that we have to have. The shame around our bodies, the shame around menstruation, like all that stuff, like is still stuff that we have to deal with, that I really don't want to pass on to my children. And so I think I did put my heart and soul and fears onto every page in that book. And even though, a lot of people say it's really joyful, and I hope it is, there is that kind of other side to it that's like, well, it's joyful only because this woman has escaped all these stereotypes and pushed the boundaries. That's why it's joyful. If you put her back in a box, it's going to be a completely different book. So I hope that point is kind of across, that it's only amazing, it's only joyful, and it's only colourful because everyone's been, I don't want to say permitted, but people have given themselves permission to be who they are. But heart and soul, just put it in your book, otherwise it's going to be non-fiction. You know what I mean?
So what's next, Dani?
Oh, what's next? My brain fires like yours on 100 million cylinders a minute. Occasionally I'll get some sleep, but I don't need a lot. So hopefully there'll be a little bit of sleep in my future. But I've got a series coming out with Larrikin House, which I actually wrote to brief. It's Unlucky Dad. So I've got, Extraordinary Mum and Unlucky Dad. Because James said he really wanted this funny story about a dad who, everything he did, he was just really unlucky. But we had this really important conversation about not having a hopeless dad. I think that's another stereotype that we don't want to lean into. So I really wanted to create this optimistic, adventurous, engaged, present dad who just happened to have the worst luck everywhere he went. And so that's where the comedy's in it. But through that, the relationships with his kids are amazing, but it's quite different to Mum, because Mum, I think, took my heart and soul and took it away. So it was nice to have this little break of just going complete slapstick ridiculousness of the adventures that this dad and his kids get up to. So they go camping and they meet this boar who takes his attraction to the dad and wants to chase him around, and he falls into a lake of leeches. And then the next book, they go fishing, and he falls down a wombat hole. And then I was thinking for the third book, what can dad do now? Because dad he's nostalgic, and he just, thinks he's 20. And so he does a bit of parkour, and that doesn't go that great for him. But it's funnily enough, I think I wrote it, too brief, but I based it on my own dad. Like, my dad still thinks he's 20. He's around about 68 now, but he still thinks he's about 20. And he always has. So I grew up watching him play soccer, indoor soccer. He was the goalkeeper. And when he got frustrated in a game, he would go out of the goals and get the ball and try and score goals. Right? And we'd be like, what are you doing? You're the goalkeeper. What are you doing? So I spent a lot of my childhood watching him play sport. He went water skiing. He's also a musician. So he just lived his best life doing all these wild things. So I kind of see where I may have gotten those traits from a little bit. But I spent so much of my childhood in waiting rooms listening to my dad get his shoulder put back in its socket. Listening to my dad scream. My mum's like, it's okay, he'll be okay. It just hurts when you get your shoulder out of socket, or having knee operations, seeing him when I was 20 have a double bypass because he just lived his life so hard, so he
was a bit unlucky.
But he was an engaged great dad, and he would, we'd spend a lot of my childhood, roller skating on Sundays together, so even though he worked a lot and he worked in a band, he'd put those times aside to be engaged. And so it's funny how I didn't even realize until I started writing, and I went, oh, this is my dad.
That's really nice.
I said to my dad, hey, have you got photos of all those, injuries you had during soccer? So I'm going to need them soon for my promo. He's like, what are you writing about? Nothing.
Nothing to see here, Dad.
Nothing to see here.
Oh, I absolutely love that. Dani, if listeners out there who haven't heard of you up until this point, and I find that hard to believe, but if listeners out there wanted to learn more about you, your podcast and your book, where can they find you?
Yeah, look, I'd say just Words and Nerds wherever you listen to your podcast. I have a website, but I really very rarely update it because I'm hopeless. I just recently updated. So if you went to it right now, it'd be fine. If you went to it in a year, I cannot speak for it. Instagram, Dani Vee Books, pretty active on the old Insta, love Insta. Twitter every now and then, and Facebook when I can be bothered. So there's there. But look, the podcast is the main jam where I guess I got my foot into the door for the industry. And the book, you can get that from Booktopia. I just signed 250 of them at Booktopia. So look, I'd love there to be none left, but I'm sure there are. And what was cool is, I grew up in Sydney, and the Dimmock store in Sydney is this glorious bookshop. It's been there for ages, and it's got these different levels, and I'd heard that they'd bought my book, and I kind of didn't believe it, and so I had to go and see for myself. And so I went into the shop with the kids section, which is just glorious and beautiful and colourful, and my book was actually at Dimmock, Sydney. So that was actually one of the moments where I just stopped and went, I'm just going to enjoy this minute of seeing my book in this actual Dimmock store in Sydney. So yeah, you can get it from there too. Look, there's in lots of bookshops, funnily enough. But it's just been really cool to have that support. And, I think you asked me, are you still in the pinch me moment? I think I'll be there forever. In 10 years, I'll be like, oh my God, I wrote a book. Like, what?
Dani, I wanted to say congratulations once again. I adored My Extraordinary Mum, and I can't wait to see what you do next. Wishing you every success, and thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Well, I can't thank you enough for asking me on. Like, I always feel really surprised when people want to talk to me about my books. So I really thank you so much. And it's weird because, as a podcaster, you're like, of course I want to talk to you. But when you're on the other side, you're like, oh, wow, this is really exciting and it's a bit terrifying. And yeah, so I really appreciate your support too. I mean, I know the work involved in podcasting. If anyone knows that, I can empathize. So I know the work, the time it takes away from other, takes away from your own creative pursuits as well. So, I can't tell you how much I appreciate, people like you and reviewers and people who just take the time out to celebrate other people's books, like we do. And it's, I get a lot from it as well, like I get so much from celebrating other people's achievements. So, I think it's medicine for us as well.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.